time from your busy schedule. My name is Nupur Anand. I take care of digital marketing and School Connect. Along with me, I have my colleague Afsha Aziz. She takes care of School Connect and University Outreach. So today we are here for a very special event, specially organized for our counselors from top schools of Nepal. And this wouldn't have been possible without Mr. Dane Rowley. So thanks to him, and thank you for taking out time from your busy schedule and sharing your thoughts on effective letter of recommendation writing. So just to give you a very quick brief about him, he's currently working as Director International Admissions at California Lutheran University, which is one of the leading universities of US. Participants from Nepal, we have Ms. Saluja Chand, Pragati Karki, she'll be joining us very soon, Sangeeta, and Ms. Nikish Thapa, and Mr. Madhav. And I'm really sorry I didn't have the photograph Mr. Veer Singh Chetri, so thank you for joining us.
Most welcome, ma'am. Thank you indeed for accepting me.
Thank you. So before I ask Mr. Rowley to take this forward from here, I would request participants from Nepal to introduce their schools and share their insight about their schools a bit. To start with, I would request Saluja ma'am to give us some insight about their school.
It's actually very late night here. Thank you, Dane. All the time, your insights have always been helpful for us. We have already had a session with you, and thank you again for that. I am from St. Xavier's College, that's in Maitigar. We are actually a Jesuit institution, and we have a lot of umbrella schools here, but then we work specifically for college part. And I represent St. Xavier's College Plus 2 and Bachelor's group. I am designated there as a Dean of Women and a counselor there. And along with me, we work in close coordination. Since Pragati is not there, so I'll take this opportunity to introduce Pragati also. She works for A-level. So we are on a mission to make counseling available to all the kids as far as possible, because I think that's something we are lacking in the context of our country. Very underestimated job in our case, though we put in effort. I think we put in effort, I don't know, it's my perception, but a little bit underestimated in our context, and slowly we are growing up. So I think at least few of us who all are here, with the help of many other people like Dane and others, we will be able to do something. Thank you, Dane.
Thank you. Glad to see you again.
I think now we can request Mr. Chetri to speak a little bit about him and his school. Mr. Chetri, you are on mute mode.
Okay, thank you so much, ma'am. I belong to Bluebird College and Bluebird Secondary School. We run bachelor's and master's programs in the college and plus 2 programs for grade 11 and 12 in science, management, and humanities in the school section for grade 11 and 12. We also have a couple of schools under us, and I work there as a CEO, and I am really interested in this counseling part. And one of my friends has just joined, Gyan Bahadur Thapa. He is also a counselor in one of our schools. It is Pragya Secondary School. I think he'll introduce himself about Pragya Secondary School, where we have school plus from this year onward, we're planning for the plus 2 section as well. So I had requested him to join, and he's here. And we believe that counseling is a very, very, very important tool, and without it, we cannot move forward in this 21st century. And Saluja ma'am had always been talking about it, and I feel really indebted that I could join today's meeting with you all. Thank you for accepting me.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chetri. Now, can I request Sangeeta to please speak a little bit about her and on behalf of her school. Madhav, I think Sangeeta, if she will be speaking, then are you fine with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Over to you, Sangeeta.
Okay. Yeah, Madhav and I, we are both from Yulan School, Nepal. We are the only IB school in Nepal. And it's been 10 years that Yulan School, it's been 10 years that IB was introduced in Yulan School. And we are both counselors as well as chemistry teachers in Yulan School. Anything else you want to add, Madhav sir?
I mean, yeah, we are the only IB diploma program in the country. We have about 200, 300 students every academic year in first year and second year. And yeah, it's been 10 years and so far so good.
Thank you so much. Now may I request Miss Nikish Thapa to speak a little bit about herself and her school. Over to you, Nikish.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Nikish, and I work in school called Kathmandu International Study Center, and it's a small school. The graduating number this year is only 8 students. So I think I am from the school where we have very least number, and also professionally, I am a psychological counselor. But last year I joined ISK, and they encouraged me to be a college counselor there. So I'm part of second cohort of IC3 Institute. But since I'm learning, I haven't written any letter of recommendation yet. So I'm very excited to be in this session because recently I have received a letter from a university in Korea asking me to write a letter of recommendation for one of my students, and I'm looking forward to this session to learn from Dane and from everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nikish. Thank you so much. And I think you will definitely learn a lot through Dane. He is a very good speaker and a very well experienced person in all these things. That's why we have chosen Cal Lutheran University and especially Mr. Dane Rowley to have this session with him. Now, can I request Mr. Gyan Bahadur Thapa to speak a little bit about his school and himself? Over to you, Mr. Gyan. Mr. Gyan, you are on mute mode.
It's okay now?
It's okay now.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Ganbaru Thapa. I'm from Kathmandu, and I'm the counselor of Pragya School. We have been together, Mr. Birsing Chetri sir, and we are together. It's been 10 years I'm teaching as well as doing the counseling to the student, and so we are still learning the Bluebird College together. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we are done with the introduction of all the participants. Now, may I request Mr. Dane Rowley to please start the presentation?
Sure. Yep. Just let me to share the screen and then I can start the PowerPoint. There we go. Thanks. All right. So after all those introductions, it makes me a little nervous to talk to you because you are, you know, I may have some experience, but you are the experts of your own environment, your own context. You know, more and more I'm becoming mindful that the work that we do in international education from the university side in the US, we have to be very careful to not further some of the colonial ideals that have really, I think, imposed themselves onto local contexts and local schools. And so I definitely don't want to be seen as the one who has all the answers. I think one of the things I love about like the IC3 movement, the work that UniBrijj is doing, is really empowering local teachers and counselors who know your students better than I do, to be able to really train you from your own context and your own situation, so that it's not these Western universities coming in and telling you what to do. So hopefully my comments today are really taken as a conversation start. Certainly the whole concept of a letter of recommendation is one that is not common in all systems around the world for universities. And so it is a very kind of US culturally based concept, although, as you mentioned, universities in Korea and other places are starting to require recommendation letters as well. So the purpose today is to really share some thoughts and this is a presentation that I put together with some other colleagues from a couple other universities, as well as a secondary school in Central America, that really is what universities in the United States and kind of in the US, North America environment, what we're looking for from you and from teachers. I also want to mention that I think all of you in your introduction have mentioned you're teachers. You're trained as teachers or psychologists. You didn't necessarily go to university to be a counselor, to guide students in their post-secondary and their master's degrees and bachelor's degrees. And so we're all learning together. I certainly didn't go to university to be a university admission counselor either. So we're all learning and having this experience. I will say I've been working in international admissions since about 2004, and I was just telling our hosts today that I usually this time of year I'm starting to plan my travel to come to South Asia. I'm planning my travel to India and Nepal and Bangladesh usually around this time. So it's bittersweet to see you. Some of you I visited your school, Olin's. I've been to a few times and presented to students, but it's definitely been a few years. But hopefully next year I'll be able to visit all of your schools and be able to connect with you in person. So what we'll talk about today, and I definitely want to leave plenty of time towards the end for discussion or for Q&A. If you do have questions or don't understand what I'm talking about, then please feel free to either speak up or use the chat box, whatever is more comfortable. But what we'll talk about is how the recommendation letter is used in the context of universities and holistic review. We'll talk about some of the best practices, pitfalls, or things to avoid, and then a couple of examples. Again, I'm not the final authority on this, but certainly want to share the experiences that I have. Now, I don't think anybody in the room was there, but I was when I was in Nepal. Was it maybe a year and a half ago? I did this workshop or a version of this workshop with some counselors at the Fulbright Center when Selena was still there. So this is something I've done there in Nepal as well for maybe some of your colleagues, or you might have been there. I don't quite remember. So this is really important to think about. What are the factors that U.S. admission directors consider to be the most important factors in an admission decision? Now, this was done, a survey just 2 years ago by the National Association of College Admission Counseling. It was a survey to ask, what are the most important factors in making an admission decision? So this really is, a survey that just shows what their top kind of priority is as they look. And obviously, I think we would all assume that grades, especially grades in university preparation courses, are the most important factors in making decisions. Are the students challenging themselves? Now, number 4, this is really interesting because as you've probably noted, there has been a massive change in SAT and ACT policies at U.S. universities in the last 6 months. One of the most significant things for university admissions really in the last decade has happened these months because of COVID. More and more universities are becoming both temporarily as well as permanently test optional for students. So I would imagine that a year from now, when NACAC does this survey again, that the importance of the SAT will be even less than it was before. But in this survey, 39% of admission directors said that the SAT or ACT was the most important. So really only about 1/3 of admission directors said, yes, this is the most important. Similarly, and this is definitely relates to international students and students in Nepal is that their national leaving certificate, their board examinations are also very important. And then of course the essay from the students themselves. And finally, what we're talking about today, number 7 and 8. Now, this may not seem like a lot. So 12% of admission directors and deans said that the recommendation letter from the counselor is the most important factor in the application. I think that makes sense. I think that if you think about the whole, the grades, the student's essay, the student's profile, those things definitely are the most important, the student's grades themselves. But where the counselor and the teacher recommendation fall is really in helping universities get a more well-rounded idea of who the student is within their own atmosphere, within their own school system, how they relate to their other students, how do they relate to teachers, what is the growth that students have experienced while they've been at your school. Those are all things that we cannot really tell from a test score. Certainly grades, we can see a trend, if we see the student's grades are going up, or if we see maybe the student has some difficulties different years, but we don't understand why those things happen. And that's where recommendation letters are so important, because it gives us a deeper sense of context and the student in their own environment. There's my advancing. Another part, digging a little bit deeper into this, the same survey asked counselors about recommendation letters significantly. So 53% of these counselors said that there's either considerable or moderate importance to the recommendation. Over half said that there's considerable importance to the teacher recommendation. So altogether, if you look at the recommendation letters, now some of you are both teachers and counselors, so your word is even more important, because you see the students day to day in the courses, but you also see them from a kind of college career guidance standpoint as well. So these things are important. Again, the recommendation letter, I'm not here to tell you that if the student has poor grades, that it's all up to you in your letter that you write to get them in. Fundamentally, the students' grades, the marks they received are the most important thing in their university search process. But again, for students that maybe have, they're somewhere in the middle between the university deciding, oh, do I want to give them a scholarship that is, say, $10,000 or $15,000, or a decision between waitlist and admit. That's where things like the student's essay and the letter of recommendation become even more important, because again, it really rounds out the idea of the student. And as I mentioned, as we move into a time where SAT and ACT becomes less important, there's some really good things about that, because testing shouldn't necessarily, of one afternoon, should not be determining the student's entire fate. And it's also a very US-centered test. The downside is that if universities don't understand the local school systems, if they don't understand what a grade means at your high school or your college, will they really have the right tools to be able to make a good decision about the student without kind of that evening SAT standardized test that everybody knows what a score in this SAT means? Not every university knows what a grade at your college or your high school means. So I think that recommendation letters are going to become even more important for you to be able to put in context the student's abilities. So these are some things that we ask ourselves as admission officers as we read recommendation letters. It's really similar questions that we ask ourselves throughout the application review process, which is fundamentally, does the student possess the social and academic qualities to be successful? Now, what it means to be successful at my university is probably different than what it means to be successful at another university. And I'll give you an example. So at my institution, the classes are fairly small. The average class size is about 17 students. It's really an environment that is focused on discussion and debate, on sharing ideas. It's a very collaborative culture at Cal Lutheran. There are some universities in the US that are highly, highly competitive, not just to get into the university, but to actually survive within the university. So in many ways, some of the Ivy League colleges are like this, where it's competitive to get in, but then also while you're in school, there is a sense of competitiveness with other students, and it's an environment that is a little bit more intense that way. So a student being successful in that context is different than a student being successful in my own context. So in that way, a letter of recommendation definitely needs to be in mind, keeping in mind where are the universities that the student are applying to, and does the rigor or the culture of the university match the student's skills and abilities? Because a student who is really focused or driven by competition may find my university to be maybe not as challenging for them, not because we're not rigorous, but because they thrive on a sense of getting pushed to do better, whereas we thrive on a sense of students coming together to work together. So it's a little different context that way. So fundamentally, does the student have the skills to be successful? Another thing that we ask ourselves is, does the letter address questions like, why is the student interested in my school? Do they think they would be a good match? How would they be successful? And then the other really important usage of the letter of recommendation in the U.S. context. I can't speak to Japan or Korea or Canada or other places, but how we use it as well is to give us a window into the student's character, the student's personality. This is where the idea of fit, are they a good match to the university, can really come into play. So there's definitely a lot. This doesn't mean you have to do all of these things, but these are some of the questions that internally we're kind of asking ourselves. This doesn't mean you have to actually explicitly answer these questions. I want to make that clear. It's more of, here are things that we're thinking about as we're reading both the recommendation letter, but these are some of the same questions that I ask myself when I'm reading the student's own personal statement as well. So here's some things that we encourage you to encourage the students to provide to you. Because we don't expect you to be able to just from memory write everything about the student. We really think the students should be empowering you with the tools necessary to write a great letter of recommendation. So we encourage students to provide you with some kind of self-assessment. Maybe it's kind of a personal, kind of like a achievement resume, not a formal CV, but ask the student to say, hey, remind me of the things that you've been involved with. Which clubs have you joined? What are you doing outside of school for your community? Just to have the student provide just a list of things that they've done that you can kind of bring in to provide that context. We also think the students should have, that didn't mean to do that. List of colleges that they're applying to, that they should be open with you about all the schools they're applying to. I think sometimes students, I don't know if this happens as much in Nepal, but sometimes students are a little bit shy on two ends of the spectrum. Sometimes students don't always want to tell everybody the really selective schools they're trying to get into. They don't want somebody to think, oh, you shouldn't apply to that school, you're not good enough. So they might not tell you their dreams of applying to this, highly selective school. And on the other end, sometimes students maybe don't want to admit that they're looking at a school that, or maybe they'll admit to you, but not their peers. They're looking at a school that nobody's heard of, or maybe a community college. So encouraging students to be open with you about where they really are looking and what might be a good fit. I'm definitely a proponent of places like community colleges and other systems that are not always automatic for students to think about because of the pathway that they provide to students for entrance to universities. And then this is something really important. I always tell students, you have to give your teacher or your counselor time. If you are late getting them the information on a recommendation letter, they're not going to be able to write as good a letter for you. So I really encourage students to give you plenty of time and notice to be able to write a recommendation so that you can really give it your attention. I think for some of you, the number of students you're going to have to write recommendations for, and some of you have already done this, it can be really daunting at certain times of the year to write as many letters as you're required to. And so encouraging students, or maybe even setting a policy that you have within your own school, that students must submit recommendation requests by a certain time before the application is due. Setting some boundaries, setting some expectations for your students to follow is important. Just like you would an assignment, you say this assignment is due this day, and you have to work on that. And I think it's important to set that expectation for students so that you're empowered to give the time that you need. So here's some general best practices. I won't review every single one of these, but I think it's important to think about what are some of the most important things to look at for a recommendation letter. What we don't want to see is just a report on student attendance or what grades they received, because we can look at the transcript or the board examinations or the IB exam. You know, we can look at some of those things and see what the students' grades are. So we don't want to see just a grade sheet in long form, but we want to see what are some of the qualities that really illuminate the student beyond the transcript. What kind of student are they? Do they participate? Are they a student? It doesn't mean that a student who is shy is not a good fit. It just means, you know, in the recommendation, you might talk about how thoughtful they are and how they really want to make sure that they kind of think things out before they contribute, versus a student who really needs to speak up in order to process. You know, as teachers and counselors, you know, there are many students who have to kind of think out loud before they come up with a concept. But then other students don't like to talk until they actually know what they want to say. Students about their leadership abilities within the classroom, are they the kind of student that if they get a concept, if they understand, then they turn around and help other students? So kind of assessing them as a team player, as a leader. How do the students receive bad news? How do students overcome setbacks? How do they receive constructive feedback? That is really important. And I think in my experience working with university students, one of the most important factors in university success is resilience, is the student's ability to recover after a setback. I think a lot of students who are very, very talented and very bright can sometimes feel like they have to be perfect. And certainly in applying to the US, there is such pressure from home, pressure from themselves to be absolutely perfect, and to, you know, often I see international students, especially those that are coming from backgrounds where their parents didn't attend university, they take on a lot of pressure to be perfect and to have great grades all the time. And so the first time they get a low grade or a low mark, it can be really challenging because they feel like they're letting everyone down. But one of the things I really look for in students is students who can take that failure, take that setback, and recover from it. So those are things that are really important. You know, we want to make sure that you know, as you're giving examples, if you can, to be able to back up some of the opinions that you have about the student with maybe an example or a very quick 1 or 2 sentence story about what happened that kind of led to that. Obviously, we want you to explain circumstances that impacted the student's performance. So again, if the student has a dip in their grades and their marks from, say, I don't know, grade 11, they're 16 years old, they make mistakes, 15 years old, maybe they got sick, maybe their family's business went under, and so the student was more focused on helping their family business and not focusing on school for a few months. But, you know, providing some context to be able to help us understand some of the nuances in that transcript that we may not see otherwise. And this is probably the most difficult thing, I think, as caring counselors. Sometimes it's really difficult. I know for me, it's really difficult to be concise. Even in my comments today about recommendation letters, I'm somebody who talks too much. I write too much. But it is really helpful for your students if you can be very clear and very concise in your recommendation letter. Letters that are, you know, 3-4 pages are not very helpful for your students. And so we'll talk a little bit more about length in a few minutes as well. So here are some ideas or some words that you might think about, or phrases that you might think about, or concepts. I think one of the most important questions you could ask yourself as you're sitting down to write a recommendation letter for a student is, what would have been missing from this school or college or the classroom if the student wouldn't have been here? and think about what do they bring in to the school. Hopefully there's an answer for that. There are cases, and I'm sure you've had students where they didn't really shine. They haven't met their potential yet. Some students are what we might call late bloomers. And I think this, at least in the US culture, that happens a lot with our young men, that the boys don't quite find their stride early on. But you know, I think sometimes you have to dig deep to find what is really standing out about the student. So we're looking for students who have, you know, passion for their subject. So if they're applying to a university that has a very selective film program or a very selective business program, then knowing why the student has a passion for that would be important. Things like curiosity, intellectual curiosity. Are they willing to learn from mistakes and take risks? I think, you know, are they a great speaker, or are they more of a thinker? Do the students collaborate with others? Do they mediate conflict between other students? How do they take ideas, process them, and then share them? And those are all things that are really important for us to have a sense of as we're looking at that. And then, of course, you know, I think most universities, even if they are very competitive, I think we are looking for students that have a sense of community, a sense of empathy, that they see themselves as a part of a connected system within the school. We want students who will actually make a difference on our campuses. We'll just want, you know, siloed individual learners. We actually want students to be part of a community of learners. And so those are some things that we hope to be able to tease out from the recommendation. A few other themes. You know, how well read is the student? Are they a student who kind of, when the day is done, they clock out, they won't think about school anymore? Or are they the kind of student that really tries to improve their knowledge? And I've seen this quite a bit with students from Nepal over the years. I remember interviewing a student last year who really wanted to study computer science, and what he was learning in school and also kind of what he was teaching himself at home wasn't enough. He went, when he would go back home to his village over the holidays, he would go and teach basic computer skills to kids back in his local area. And so he was taking kind of this passion that he had for computer science and then actually using it in a way to improve his community as well. And I've seen that a lot with students from Nepal, the sense of community, the sense of trying to connect their skills with trying to improve society, improve the economy, and improve life. I think I've seen that more there than many other places. So definitely accentuate that and encourage students to find connections between their life in their community and their passion or their academics as well. I've talked about classroom leadership, open-minded and objective. I really like to hear, if this is true, I really like to hear the kind of work ethic that the student has. That doesn't mean that students who are just busy all the time have a strong work ethic. I think sometimes in our societies, we confuse a lack of sleep with being productive. And I fall into that too. Just because I'm busy doesn't mean I'm working really hard. So I think, you know, knowing the difference between a student with a really strong work ethic versus a student who just doesn't know how to say no to taking on more responsibility, and then they burn themselves out. And I'm sure you've seen that with some of our rising leaders. They tend to join too many clubs, take on too much leadership, and then they get too busy, and then their schoolwork suffers. This happens, especially with our really gifted and talented students. So helping them see the difference between being busy and working hard is important, because when they get to university, they have some of those same challenges as well. I've talked about resilience. I've talked about students who are receptive to criticism. If the student is really fun and creative, share that. It's okay to talk about how funny the student is, or how the student uses humor as a way to build relationships with people. It's okay to be a little bit personal in some of those facets. It doesn't have to be, and again, this is very specific to US universities. The letter of recommendation does not have to be highly structured, highly formal. It can actually share some interesting tidbits or some interesting kind of personality quirks that the student might have, talents that the student might have as well. So these are some words, you know, and this is another thing I do want to say. one of the other challenges that I find in the US system is that we expect students and their counselors to have almost a native grasp of English. I don't think that's a fair expectation. I think, again, it perpetuates this idea that if you don't have a strong a linguistic background in English as I have, then somehow you're not fit to be a good counselor or write a good recommendation letter. And that's not fair, and that's just not true. So I want to be careful in talking about some of these words. I think for counselors that are writing in a language that's not their native language, there is a tendency to really focus on the basic message, which is fine. But these are some of the words that we do hear a lot. So I think if you can find maybe a more, I think a more kind of detailed way or some different language to be able to use versus just saying, this is a good student, or this student works hard, or this student is very dedicated. Those are things that we hear a lot. It would be better to say, instead of saying the student is dedicated or the student is hardworking, you might say the student really knows how to put in priorities. They get the job, they work until the job is done. They know how to stick with something and see it through the end. That shares the same thing, but that might not just be the same as hearing over and over, dedicated, hardworking, things like that. The same thing I tell students with their essay, that be really careful to be too refined so that it sounds like anybody could write this essay. And in the same way, again, this is really difficult when when you're writing many recommendation letters for students, to start to have a template or start to write some of the same things. And I realized it is trash day in my neighborhood, and so I'm gonna go shut some windows so that you don't hear the trash trucks picking up our refuse. I'll actually be right back in just a minute.
I believe everybody is listening to each and every word and really learning something new. I can see the faces.
That's good. That's good.
That's wonderful.
All right. Sorry about that. Figured you didn't need to hear that. Okay, so some other things that we're looking for. Some other things that we're, I guess, trying to avoid or not look for, actually, I should say. Don't just reiterate facts that are provided in the application. I've mentioned this. Don't just revisit everything that we've already seen. If you know that the student is going to share in their application that they are the president of a club or other things, if you're going to share that, then share something that actually adds new information to that. So don't just restate the facts that we see somewhere else. Definitely don't underestimate the impact of a great recommendation letter. And again, I mentioned this very briefly, but this is something that happens sometimes when counselors get overwhelmed or teachers get overwhelmed with the number of students that you have to write recommendation letters for. And this happens a lot in September and October, when students are really anxious about getting all their applications in and they don't give you a lot of time. It's really important not to use kind of generic letters where you just kind of float in a couple of details, but the general letter is very similar. And that makes it very difficult for you. Certainly over the years, you'll get better at kind of, providing those, but I think that's something that is very important. This is one that I think is a balance. I think, if you feel like it's important to state what your credentials are or the subject that you teach or what your own background is, then my recommendation would be to add that at the very end as kind of as an afternote or an end note. Don't take too much time in the actual letter about the student to share more about you. So I think as an aside or maybe as an end note, maybe share what your profile is or what you teach to provide us that context, but then focus on the student in the actual main body of the letter. That can be important. One of the things that we identify, if the student has some low marks in a specific subject, or if they have low marks overall and the counselor never talks about that in the recommendation letter, and they only talk about what a great athlete the student is or what a great leader the student is, and they never even address the academic struggles, then typically that is a warning for us, that the student really doesn't necessarily have a reason or a deeper context to why their grade suffered. If they have a low grade in a specific subject, or if they've struggled but they're doing better, don't hesitate to address that. Talk about that. Talk about, share your thoughts about what the student's trajectory is. Because one of the things we're really most concerned with, if we see students who have struggled academically, we want to know what their momentum is. I'm not a science guy. I studied history and politics in university, but I know enough about physics that momentum is very important. This idea that if you have a running start from high school and college towards university, that momentum is going to help you be more successful when you start. So one of the most important things we're looking for is our students on that trajectory. So maybe they started out and they did very poorly, but now they're on an upward swing. Those are all things that we're very interested in seeing. Don't agree to write a letter with 1 day's notice. And this is really challenging. Again, setting some boundaries for yourself so that you can have a life, so that you don't have to tell your family or your friends that I'll see you in 2 months. I've got to write letters of recommendation, although that probably happens sometimes too. But definitely set some of those boundaries for the students and set those expectations. I mentioned this, but please don't hesitate to include what the student's working on. We don't assume that students are a finished product when they're 17 or 18, or if they're a university student applying for master's. We're all a work in progress. And so, sharing some things that students are working on, but always with a spirit or an idea of growth and of potential. I think as counselors, one of the most important things that we can do is to treat students like they are already the best version of themselves, to see them for the potential that they have, not just what they are in front of you, but kind of seeing them for what they become and holding them accountable to kind of what their potential is. And I think as we have that perspective of that student as an open and as an unfinished product, I think we can write letters that really share that idea of potential and hope. One thing to avoid, this happens sometimes where the counselor is concerned about the student reading what you write, or maybe the parents getting a copy of your recommendation letter. And so sometimes if there's maybe a more tricky situation, or if the student got in trouble, or if the student has some behavioral issues, counselors might write it in a way that they assume I'm going to understand a more nuanced kind of reading between the lines, which means you're being very vague, and you think that I'll just understand and pick up what you're not saying. That's not really true. We can't read your mind. So if there are things that you want to be able to share to the university, or you feel like the university should know that are not things you feel comfortable putting in the letter, then I think it's best to reach out through email or through WhatsApp or other means to the university to share some of that information. These things happen very rarely, but it's really more tricky cases about that. Students on their application, when they fill out the common application, they actually should be marking, there's a place where they can mark that they waive the right to review the recommendation letter, which means that if the students waive that right, and they should be open with you about that, then it means that if they attend my university and they're asking to see their file, we won't let them see the recommendation letter, that's something that's confidential. Now, if students don't waive that right, then they do, they would have access to that. So that's something that could be important if there's a more delicate situation with the student or with the family. And after we're done, if you have questions about that, we can talk about that more. So here's some things to think about. What is the right length? What should I discuss or disclose about the student's disability or their identity? These are things that we can talk about. Do you recommend quotes from other teachers or other administrators? How much do recommendation letters really factor in decisions? And how do I write a letter for a student when I cannot enthusiastically recommend them? I think these are some of the most challenging questions that we find that counselors and teachers have to struggle with. And I'll talk about just a few of them and then open it up to see if you have any thoughts or comments about it. I don't know if there actually is a right length. I think it's similar to the personal essay that in general, we're looking for about a page. However, this actually gets down to the third point. Do you recommend quotes from other teachers or administrators? One of the things that I've seen that counselors do that I actually really like is maybe the counselor doesn't know the student as well, and so they might go to a teacher who knows the student very well, maybe taught them for 2 years, and ask them for 2 or 3 sentences about the student. And then what you can do is within that letter, you can actually embed that quote from that teacher about the student to give your recommendation a little bit more context, a little bit more life. And again, if you're a new counselor, or if the student is one that you just didn't interact with as much as a counselor, or maybe you're a teacher who's also a counselor, but you didn't ever teach that student in your subject. These are ways to kind of solicit quotes or other ideas from other teachers. If you do that, if you share a few of those quotes, then it's okay, I think, for the letter to get a little bit longer. Maybe it's a page and a half, because you're bringing in the ideas from other people at your school to be able to help provide that context for the recommendation letter. Should I discuss or disclose details that may be relevant but are personal? I think this is it has to be something that's case by case. I think if the student has a learning disability that has impacted what I see on the transcript, as long as the student is comfortable with you sharing that, then that's fine to share. You know, the way that we review students with learning disabilities or physical disabilities, we don't hold that against them at all. If anything, by law in the U.S., we cannot discriminate against students because they have a learning disability. What I want to see is, do the students have the potential to be successful with the right resources? So, for example, a student has maybe a processing disorder, and they need a note taker. They can't just sit in class and both listen and take notes if they're in a lecture. Then you could say the student has this difficulty, but as long as your university has a note-taking program in your disability services, then this student will be very successful. So that's the context where we would maybe want you to discuss a student with some challenges. In terms of identity, this one can be really, really challenging. I think, you know, all of us that work with young people know that there are students who will struggle with their identity in terms of their gender identity or their sexual identity. I think in some school sites, discussing those things might be taboo, or maybe even within the student's family, those things might not be a welcome conversation. I would say if it's something that the student discloses to you in confidence, unless you know they're going to mention it in their application, then you want to respect their privacy. I also think, and this is a workshop for another time or resources for another time, but I do have some workshops and presentation or some resources that I've put together for college guidance counselors to work with students who would identify as LGBTQ. And because, you know, for them, the college search process is even more complicated in terms of family dynamics, culture, religion, and then also the culture in the U.S. And so if that is something that you'd be interested in getting some of those resources, you can always email me as well. I'd be happy to share that. But I think really respecting the student's privacy is really important if they want that to be private. Now, if the student is very forthcoming about that in their college essay or other things, that's fine. That's something that you can discuss as well. And then, you know, the other questions, I think the last question is probably one of the most difficult. And I've found this as well when students who work for me have come to me and asked me for a professional recommendation letter. How do you write a letter for a student that you cannot recommend enthusiastically? Because you feel like maybe the student just is not doing as well as they should. They're not meeting their potential. That's really difficult. I think in those cases, it might actually be good to, you know, if you're a teacher, I think it's okay to tell the student, no, I don't think I'd be a great person to write a recommendation. Why don't you ask, you know, this other teacher, or why don't you ask this other person to write the letter? I think as a teacher, that's okay. As a counselor, most universities expect you to write a letter of recommendation, and so that can be a little bit difficult. You can't initially tell the student no. I think in those cases, you do find a teacher or other counselor or other administrator at your school and ask them for some input to be able to incorporate their ideas into the recommendation letter. This last one, do I write a letter for a student if I believe the university they're applying to is not a good fit? I think that's something you have to really discuss with the student and figure out what their plans are. So at this point, I want to take a pause, and I want to be mindful of the time as well, and we have a few more slides to cover, but I want to stop to see if you have any questions or anything you want to discuss about this slide in particular.
Anybody has a question till here?
Anybody? Or anybody with experience working with any of these challenges or these difficult questions?
I think the question that you're talking about, the enthusiastic recommendation, is a little bit difficult, as you said. It's quite challenging in those cases.
Yeah, so what have you done? Have you had a situation like that, and how did you respond to it?
Actually, as you mentioned, Dane, we are supposed to write recommendation letter to everyone because US, it's expected for the counselors to write the recommendation letter.
Right.
So basically for us, it's difficult for us to know everyone, but we have designed a tool where we have a self-assessment of the kids. Then we go on with if those self-assessment is very helpful for us, it's like a kind of a form that they fill in. And then if we don't get anything out of that, then we have a personal interview with the kids also, like, so that we do not mix match the things with other teachers and all, and then we communicate with the teachers. So it's a lengthy process.
Yeah.
But at times, again, even if you do that, sometimes it becomes difficult.
It is, and sometimes students are they're even shy with somebody they've known for a long time, or it's hard to get information out of them. You know, we've all had students where you're sitting in front of them and they just, how do you get them to share? How do you get them to actually talk? You know, I was at one conference where there was a session about using music in the college guidance process, which was really fascinating. So these counselors talked about, for really difficult students, if they know the student is maybe more creative, asking them questions like, what's on your playlist right now? Or you know, what is music that inspires you when you're working? Or maybe what's a recent film that really, so sometimes it might even be good to kind of learn some things that the student cares about. But yeah, there's just a lot of things, but I love what you mentioned about an intake form, or kind of a form that the students have to fill out that has information about them, sitting down with them. You know, I feel like the students who are the best in the group and the students who are probably the low end of the group are the ones that we probably spend the most time with as counselors. And often it's the ones who are doing well enough that sometimes actually the ones we may not know as well, because they've never had to come into your office because they've been in trouble or need guidance or other things. But yeah, I think those are great things that you put together to kind of help you with that. It sounds like you're definitely doing some great things.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then, you know, for all of us, it's definitely a learning process.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts about any of these? Right. Oh, yeah. All right, we'll go ahead and we'll talk a little bit more. So these are some examples, and I share these not to say that they're perfect. Actually, all the examples that I share have some really good elements, and then they also have some things that I think could be a little bit better. So, but they do kind of cover a range of styles with recommendation letters. So this is a selection from one letter of recommendation for a student. They said, edgy, hip, perhaps even avant-garde. Jared is a terrific musician, an outstanding athlete, and maintains an unconventional, slightly off-kilter funkiness and a warm, engaging persona that make him genuinely likable kid. He has just recently figured out how to be a student. I like this, and I also struggle with this at the same time. So I think it probably goes a little bit too much to the extreme of using more colorful or more nuanced language. I think, and this is not something, a challenge that I've seen in Nepal or India or South Asia, of counselors using language that not everybody would understand. Not everybody knows what avant-garde is. I don't even know if I could fully define what avant-garde is. So I think if you're using language that kind of takes a little bit more, you know, one of the things I recently started I went back to school, so I'm part-time doing a doctorate program. And one of the things I'm finding is that academics like to write in ways that only other academics can understand. So when you're writing a recommendation letter, don't write it in a way that only another counselor can understand. Certainly write it in a way that is going to be more natural. I think one important thing that I'll note right now is that the idea of what an admission officer or what an admission office looks like may be different than what students or even some counselors expect. Even though I'm a middle-aged white guy, I'm not actually the typical admission officer for international admissions. Probably what's maybe more of the common is somebody that is maybe a decade younger than me, a female, somebody who's kind of towards the middle start of their career, are typically the ones at universities who are reading applications for international students. It's a highly diverse field. You have students, or you have counselors, university admission counselors who come from different backgrounds. Many might actually have been international students themselves. So writing a letter in a way that actually would be something that would build on kind of common ideas, and not just as, I mean, this one is really interesting, but it sounds like the counselor is trying to be a little bit more impressive with their use of colorful language than they are actually talking about the student. The other thing I'll note about this is, I don't know if I like this last sentence. He has just recently figured out how to be a student. I think you have to be really careful in highlighting a student's weaknesses this way. I think in the wrong context, this could make it sound like the student really wasn't trying before. On the other hand, if that's really true, if the student really didn't start trying until the end, then maybe that's something you have to kind of fess up to or talk about with the recommendation letter. Here's another example, a little bit different. Was every day comparable to this glorious moment? I'm always curious what this moment was, because I didn't put this selection together. But what was every day comparable to this glorious moment? No, but that day in particular, along with some of his writings in his journal, allowed me to see a potential that was buried beneath the rubble of an apathetic armor and socially stereotypical behavior. In other words, Adolfo is better than he was, but not as good as he can be. I think this one takes some risks, but I think overall it works. I think you have to be careful. The one word that I would be, that I wouldn't recommend using, like in this selection, is apathetic. It's similar to the advice I give students about their essay. Be really careful about kind of the psychology of language. There are certain words that have such a negative connotation that even if you're using the word to talk about how much they've grown, just the fact that you're putting that word out there, the main word that just based on kind of the way humans think and process information, they're going to focus on that word apathetic more than almost any other word in that paragraph. And apathetic is the opposite of what we want to see with a university student. More, and I think as a high school teacher or counselor, that a student who doesn't care, who is ambivalent to their education, who doesn't care about themselves or others, apathetic, somebody who has that apathy, that is the opposite of what we want. And so I think that's my main problem with this election is, again, and the whole the takeaway point that I encourage you to think about from here is even if you're talking about a student's weaknesses, using language that is positive, that has a sense of momentum, a sense of growth, is really, really important. And I think that at the end they come together with that. I really like the end, which is he's better than he was, he's not as good as he can be. That still shows that he's a work in progress. But again, it builds on positive language and doesn't reinforce negative language. Admission officers and counselors are humans as well. And so, help us to not necessarily tease in on the most negative aspect, but on the positive aspects. And then the last one, and this one is really, really interesting to me. So I'm interested to hear what you have to say. So during the time that I have known Laura, I have found her to be an excellent student. Her academic performance has been very appropriate to her situation. Laura is an exchange student from Colombia. The language barrier that exists has been difficult to overcome, but she is progressing well. She is taking subjects and courses that she's not accustomed to taking and is doing good work. Her progress is very good. This is as the counselor wrote it. So there are a couple of grammatical and typing errors, which is instructive for us because, again, I don't expect that you have fluency of English as a native language speaker. But I think it is important to really make sure, just like the students' essays are really important to be kind of clear of some of those errors. The irony is that I feel like the counselor is talking in a way that's a little bit condescending to the student. Yet, it's almost like the counselor is saying, well, the student is, exchange student, maybe their English isn't very good, but yet the counselor themselves is using poor English. And so I think there's some irony in some of the judgment that I feel. But I think where one of the reasons why I use this selection is that it's important as you're talking, even though you're talking from a position, you're a counselor, you're a teacher, in society and in the school, there is an elevated position associated with that. Yet when you're writing the recommendation letter, you don't necessarily want to talk in a way that's condescending or in a way that it sounds too superior. And I think that, again, that's a very culturally founded idea that I think that's in US higher education or in US admissions, it's a little bit more egalitarian. So even if things aren't like that in the structure of your school, and there are those kind of barriers or those separations, when you're thinking about who's reading that recommendation letter, I think is important. So not sounding too judgmental. I think that it's important to think about that. And then the other thing I don't like about this selection is, the last sentence, her progress is very good. Again, there's so many other ways that don't really take up too much more space, but there's so many better ways to talk about her progress being very good. Even in the last example, to say they're better than they were, but they have potential to do even better, that's saying the same thing as her progress is very good, but it paints a better picture for the admission officer. So hopefully those examples are instructive. Again, they're meant to be both kind of good and bad all in the same thing, and be a little bit more instructive that way. So at this point, those are the slides that I have and some of the comments that I have. I hope that this is, even, depending on your experience level, some of you have been writing recommendation letters for years. For others, this may be newer, or you're at a newer school with a smaller number of students. So hopefully there's been something out of here that's been helpful. But I'd be interested to hear what your questions are. Are there things that you want me to talk about that I haven't talked about yet, or some things that you want to hear more about?
Thank you so much, Dane, for a wonderful presentation. It was really informative. And if anybody is having any question, please feel free to ask.
Sorry, yeah, if you have questions, please ask. This doesn't mean I'm stopping, because I'll still answer questions, but I do want to put my email up there as well. And you can always reach out to me through our folks, our hosts here as well. But yeah, sorry, did somebody have a question?
Yeah, so I was asking, like, there are times when the student is like from 2-3 years back, and then and the counselor has also been changed, and then the student applies when the new counselor after the new counselor has been appointed, and he asks for the recommendation letter which has already been written by the old counselor. So during that time, how should the new counselor upload the recommendation letter, since it has already been written by the other counselor and it has to be uploaded in the Common App or College App? Or
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in that situation, do you actually have access? Do you have a copy of that old letter?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what I would recommend, and what would work for my school, would be for you to maybe submit your own statement that would say, here are the conditions. The student left. The student, I'm new, but I can share, and I can vouch that this is an authentic letter. I'm going to share with you what the previous counselor wrote, and then send that letter in as well. And it's something where if you have access to electronically, you could actually kind of copy and paste it into your letter as a quote, kind of a cited or a quoted letter. But as long as you're telling us that would be acceptable. I think if it's a letter that's a little bit, that's a couple years old, the main question we have is it authentic? Is it real? And if you can vouch for it and say, I can attest that this is the actual letter that was written, that's a little bit closer to the student's context. And then maybe the only thing you share in your letter is what the student has been doing since that letter was written. And that's where maybe you need to have a conversation with the student and say, you left school 2 years ago. What have you been doing since? And then maybe just a short paragraph from you about what the student's been up to in that gap year or those 2 years since they left the school, and then include the old letter as well. And I've seen that a few times there in Nepal. I've also seen it with students who have compulsory military service, where they have to finish high school and then they go serve, like Singapore, they have to go serve for a couple of years or other things, and then they apply to university. So it's actually pretty common. And I think because of COVID-19, I think a year from now, 2 years from now, we're going to see it even more. We're going to see that students are having to take a gap because of travel restrictions, or they really need to focus on helping their family, recover economically or other things. And so I think we're probably going to see that even more over the next couple of years. But that's a great question. Hopefully that is a little bit helpful.
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
So with respect to that, Dane, is it advisable to write down if a student takes a gap year, like what the child is doing and all those stuffs?
Yeah, I think students have this idea that a gap year or even 2 years is a huge detriment in the university's eyes, and also in the visa officer's eyes. I hear that worry a lot. And I hear it from students also that are graduating with a bachelor's and then are applying to the US as a master's. They're worried about a gap between their bachelor's and master's as well. And I really, those worries are not, they shouldn't worry the student the way they do. We actually really like to see students who have a gap year or maybe even 2 years. It's really about identifying what they've been up to. Have they just been sitting around, or have they been studying to retake exams so they have better marks? Or are they in a situation where they've had to work for 2 years to save up enough money to then be able to study abroad? Or maybe I had a student from one of the schools in Nepal who is a dual US citizen, spent half of their life in the US and then part of their life in Kathmandu, but they took a gap year to study their native language better and their own family culture before coming back to the US, because they knew that this was the time in their life that they could devote to studying their local culture, language, and religion. But if the student didn't tell me that, then I would have to wonder, okay, why did you delay your education? But once the student shared that with me, that's actually really impressive. And that makes them even a more attractive student than they were before. So I think, yeah.
But in our cases, most of the time, besides the case you talked about, mostly we have like our schools, the students, they mostly take a gap year because they go to some engineering colleges here in Nepal. And then they want to rejoin. I mean, they think about the US. So will that be advisable to write the recommendation letter? Like some of them, they have even joined the college and then suddenly, or like in the process, they think like they need to go to abroad now, and then they try again for that. So.
Yeah, and that's okay too. I think where that situation gets a little bit tricky is that universities in the US expect that if a student has taken any university level coursework, that they disclose that in their application and that they share those transcripts with us as well as high school. It doesn't mean that they will, for one thing, it's in the student's interest if any of those courses are transferable, even as elective courses. that could actually lessen the amount of time it will take for them to graduate from our university. Where we run into problems is when students don't disclose it because maybe they didn't do very well, or they have this idea that they want to start fresh. Unfortunately, when it comes to university admission policies, there's really no such thing. The student can't just forget that they attended a college for a year and then just not tell us. Because if we find out, one of the expectations when the student fills out the Common App is that they have shared everything about their educational history. If they leave that out, then universities take that as not being honest in their application, and that could put their admission in jeopardy. So in light of that, I think it is good to mention, yes, they attended another school. That's not a bad thing. We don't hold that against a student. If anything, it just means we want to see what those marks were. In some cases, the school, if it's a vocational or technical college, maybe the grades aren't transferable. But what would be good for the student, and actually would be an advantage for the student, is that you could paint a picture to say, the student really didn't have a clear idea of where they wanted to study or what they wanted to study. So they took some time locally to take advantage of education here to be able to do more reflection and more growth. Now they're ready to study abroad. That paints it as a picture, instead of showing a student who didn't have their act together or is undecided. It paints a picture of a student who's learning and growing and is on their way. So I think in that context, it would be really good to share that they've been taking some courses, trying some things out. One of the things you may not realize is that is incredibly common in the US for students to go to a community college first. At Cal Lutheran, a third of our new students every fall are students who are actually transferring from either a community college or another college. Now, some universities don't have as much of a transfer kind of population as we do, but it's actually quite common for students and parents more and more to say, you know what, son or daughter, you don't know what you want to study. I'm not sure I want you to attend, an expensive liberal arts college. Why don't you go to the local technical school or the local community college, take some classes for you to decide what you want to do, and then, apply as a second-year student or apply as a kind of freshman plus. So that's actually okay. It's just what I encourage you to talk about with your students is to be forthright about that, to actually put that in the common application or in their application for the university that they have attended some other courses, and what does that help them learn about themselves. So it's kind of like taking a gap year to work or to study, or maybe to be a monk or something else. It's not so much that they took a gap, it's what they've been doing and what they've learned about themselves through that experience that is probably most important. And the recommendation letter is a great place to be able to discuss that. And their essay is also a really good place for them to discuss that. And we love to see where the student's voice about their essay and their experience matches what the counselor also has to say, that we see that there's a connection. I think that is even more powerful for the student.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question. If a student is very bad at academics and he's not doing well, but he still wants to study abroad, how do we go about writing a recommendation?
Oh boy. Well, I think if their student's really good at being a test taker, I think even though there's a lot of universities that are becoming test optional, most universities are still, when they say test optional, it means they're still going to accept the test scores. Then there's still going to be a factor if the student chooses to send them. I think if the student is maybe not great in the classroom, but they're a good test taker, then encouraging them maybe to do the SAT or ACT might help them in their college search. Because again, it may help them kind of provide a little bit more academic context. These are really tough cases. I think in some ways,
and other things, but not good in academics.
I think
he stands no chance, or how
I think one of the questions I would want to know as an admission counselor is, why have they not been good at academics? There's a number of reasons for young people why they don't try. Is it because they really they're not strong enough in fundamentals of math and maybe English and science to do well yet. If that's the case, then maybe doing some kind of, in the UK, we talk about foundation courses. In the US, I know a lot of for-profit pathway companies are trying to sell students on this idea that you have to do a Shorelight or Into pathway program. I don't really advise that, because community colleges are such a fantastic way for students who have not done well. So that would be my recommendation, honestly. And this is where students would be resistant, because they don't necessarily know community colleges as well, or there may be a stigma about going to a junior college or a community college. But the idea of a community college is that, for one thing, really the only thing it takes to be admitted is that they finish high school. The philosophy of community colleges, as you know, are kind of more open enrollment. And community colleges are better equipped than most universities to help students build a stronger foundation of English writing and of mathematics. For example, with maths, if a student is getting C's or D's in their math courses, then it probably means they need to go back and maybe kind of rebuild that foundation. At a university like Cal Lutheran, we don't have really low math courses. We kind of start out with the expectations that students are ready to take kind of college level math. So if they don't have that yet, then we would encourage them to do a year of community college first to build that foundation. Otherwise, this is a really hard thing with a counselor where the student has dreams that you're not sure that they are very realistic. And how do you talk to a student who, and how do you not be the crusher of dreams? What's that?
So we cannot discourage them. We will have to, we need to write recommendations.
Yeah, I think, well, in those cases, I think maybe accentuating the positive.
Yeah.
I do like it when counselors are just very forthcoming. And they say, if you look at the students' transcripts, they clearly have struggled. However, here is the potential I see. Mm-hmm. Here are the things they're good at. Here are the things that they excel in.
Yeah, highlight the things they're good at.
Yeah, and I think, and if they're really bad in all subjects but one, maybe encouraging them to get that teacher to write a recommendation letter, or maybe include a quote from that teacher. However, on the other hand, I would say, I've seen many students in the past who have struggled with, say they struggle with maths. I've actually found some really great recommendation letters from their math teacher. And so I'll see, you didn't get a good mark on this math class, but the math teacher is actually the one writing the recommendation letter, because they're going to talk about how hard you've worked, how it doesn't come naturally to you, how you struggled. I think where the most difficult cases are the students who aren't trying hard. And I think as a counselor, you have to get really creative. And to be honest, but maybe kind of accentuate those positive things. And then in the end, you have to kind of help the student put their best foot out there. And if they don't get accepted, then sometimes, unfortunately, as people working with young people, you have to be there when they're kind of having unrealistic dreams, but then you also have to be there for them when those dreams are shattered and they're trying to pick up their pieces of, what do I do now? Right. And then unfortunately for students, that happens with both funding as well as with academics as well, right? Students have these ideas that universities are going to give them full funding, and they have this dream to go, and then all of a sudden it doesn't look like it's going to happen. Then what? And again, this is not a commercial for community colleges, but this is also a great way. I look at schools like Orange Coast College or other places where the tuition fees are much lower than most universities. That might be another aspect for them. But yeah, you bring up some great points. And I think based on the students that you have there, you have some really high flying students. I think all of you do. Students that have very strong aspirations, and also some students that are kind of coasting. The students that maybe are being a little lazy because their families, have more funding or other things. You see a wide spectrum of students for sure.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? I think I probably kept you later than planned, but I have time. So if you have other questions.
Any other question from anyone? Mr. Chetri, Mr. Gyan Bahadur, Ms. Nikesh Thapa, any question from your end?
Not at all, not at all from my side. It's really insightful. We're enjoying this lesson, in fact.
Glad to hear that. Yeah, and if you have other questions, please feel free to reach out. And like I said, I really hope that at some point we can connect in person, and I can meet with your students in person. But until then, it'll have to be virtual like this for the foreseeable future, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks for joining me. I really enjoy doing these types of workshops. Obviously, you can find a ton of information about my institution on the web, and if you are curious about my university, then great. But I love to do these kind of workshops that are less about my school and really more about connecting with you as a counselor. I really respect the work that you do, and like I said, I think it's important to be a counselor for your students. Don't try and be a counselor modeled completely after the US system, because your culture, your context is different. And so I think programs like IC3 and others that really enhance and empower local counselors is great. And I love to see that. So any way that we can kind of help you in that journey, please definitely let us know.
Thank you so much, Dane, for this presentation. And I would like to say thank you to everyone who has taken out time for this session. And I really look forward to have more wonderful sessions with all of you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Take care of yourself.
Thank you, everybody. And
Thank
thanks,
you.
UniBrijj. Thanks to Asha. Thanks to
Thank
the,
Thank you. Thank you so much for this insightful session indeed.
Yeah. Thanks. Have a great night.
Thank you.
You have a good day.
Thanks.